which is what we're going to see in Philippians chapter 1. In Philippians 1, Paul's specifically talking about preachers, but I believe that this attitude that he's talking about here can be seen in all disciples everywhere and all through Paul's different epistles, which is Paul's saying that there's two different types of people, two different types of disciples with two different types of priorities. And he brings that up here talking about preachers. When we read this passage, we usually like to get to verse 18 and talk about we rejoice in the gospel being preached, but we're not going to have time to cover that today. I want to just cover the difference, the distinction that Paul makes. Look in verse 15, if we'll start there. Paul says, some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, some also from goodwill. There's a distinction made right there, right? Some people preach the gospel because of envy and strife, but some people preach the gospel out of goodwill. Verse 16, the former preach Christ for selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. There's a type of person that shares the gospel out of selfish ambition, and that's a phrase that Paul uses a lot in his epistles. He also uses the phrase personal gain a lot. That there are some that share the gospel just because they're selfish, and they're considering only the things that they can get out of their work instead of what others and what God can get out of their work. Verse 17, now here's the other people on the other side of the line. The latter, out of love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. There's some people that share the gospel for selfish ambition. There's some people that share the gospel for love's sake, right? And those are two different types of people. And as we go through some passages that I have the time that I have with you, I think we'll see very quickly that this is not just talking about preachers, but this is talking about disciples in general. That as a Christian, we have the responsibility and we have been encouraged greatly to share the gift we've been given with others, right? And that's not always easy. It's not always fun. You know, there's different levels of it, but we've all been encouraged to participate in that somehow. Some of us are Christians, and some brethren are Christians purely because of selfish ambition. They're only considering their rewards, they're only considering what they can get out of it, and that's their attitude and their priority. There is another type of Christian that is concerned about love. And they're concerned about what they can give to God, not necessarily what all the good things God can give to them, and they're concerned about other people. And as we go through these different passages, we're going to see that distinction made. And so what I'd like to talk about with you is talk about Paul's priorities, because Paul is certainly on the side where he does the things he does because of love. And I think that's the type of disciple that we all want to be. As I go into this, let me make this very clear. This sermon is not supposed to come off as a rebuke. I actually think that this group here does a very good job, the majority, of doing the things we do out of love and not out of selfish ambition. And I really think that that's something that this group has really taught me. You know, I look back at my life the past 8 years, and I do believe I'm much more concerned about the way I present myself, my influence on others. I much more care about the salvation of others than I did before I came here. I really think I've grown in that way. And I think I'm allowed to say that I think I've grown in this way. And I give credit to that growth to obviously God, but also to the brethren here. That this is something that I think Gardendale is actually very good at. And so I don't want this to look at like something that I'm fussing at y'all about. I really want this to be something encouraging, that something we can continue to pursue, which is that we wouldn't be selfish people in our priorities, but our priorities would be to love God and to love others like the Lord has commanded us to do. Let me show you what I'm talking about, and then after this, we're going to go and look at our passages. This is the way it works in my mind. We have a new convert, and when that person becomes a Christian, that person probably has two priorities. And I think these are good priorities for where they're at. They've just been baptized. Well, what's their number one priority after that? Well, obviously, it's their relationship with God. That's why they obeyed the gospel, right? They care about their relationship with God, and so they did what God asked them to do. That's their number one priority. What would be their number two priority for that new convert? Well, I'm going to sum things up in a big way and just say their well-being. that there is a need for them to take care of themselves, and they care about their personal well-being, and they should care about their personal well-being. Ephesians 5, Paul says, no one ever hated their own body, but nourishes it and cherishes it. The commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. There's an implication given in the gospel that you are supposed to care about yourself and you are supposed to love yourself. You're supposed to take care of your well-being. And it is right that number 2 here be their own well-being. That's a good thing for them to do, especially with number 1 being their relationship with God. Now let's talk about growth. This person grows in 10 years, and they do the things that they're supposed to do. They study about God's word, they learn more about God, and they have a lot of spiritual growth. What I have seen in my experience is that these priorities change a little bit as we grow, where number 1 is still their relationship with God. But number 2 comes in, and it's no longer their well-being, but it becomes their well-being for others. That is, number 2 becomes their influence as Christ's representative. That becomes something that's important now. And maybe it becomes much more important than it was when they were first converted, where this Christian who's been a Christian for a while constantly evaluates themselves as whether they're being of a good job of being Christ's representative. They're concerned about their influence on others. They're concerned about leading others to salvation. They're concerned about being a good example. And that's something that grows and develops as we be Christian and for a number of years, and it gets better and it gets worse. It depends on where we're headed. But that new thing is that we're concerned about other people. We're concerned about bringing Christ to those other people. And then what's number 3? Well, it's their well-being, right? It's still there, but it no longer holds the significance as it used to as we mature and learn more things about God and learn more things about ourselves. Now, this new convert has another option. They don't have to grow. They could get worse in their priorities. And the bottom of this would be in 10 years, they become this B-type Christian. Now, I'll refer to this, you're A-type Christian, you're B-type Christian, where their priorities look something like this. Number 1, it's not their relationship with God, it's their salvation. They only care about whether they're going to be saved or not at the end. Their pure relationship with God only revolves around whether they're going to get a reward or not. And so this is your checklist type Christians. This is your Christians that aren't pursuing God. They want to just do enough where they can seek and get salvation somehow. That's all they're concerned about. And you'll hear people use phrases like, well, I don't think it's about our salvation. Do I really have to do this? I mean, am I still going to be saved if I don't do this? And that's their only concern. When they're not asking, is this something that would glorify God? Is this something I need to be doing? They're not asking those questions. They're only concerned about their rewards. And I think this is a weak brother or sister. And what's number 2? Well, number 2 is their well-being. And really, these two things go together. The only reason why they're still interested in their salvation is because it's their well-being to do so. They are only concerned about me, myself, and I. That's the bottom of this list, right? Now, Paul talks about these people in the epistles, and he uses these phrases to describe these people. These people are interested in personal gain, or he'll use the phrase like we saw in Philippians 1, selfish ambition. They are only a Christian for the things that they can get out of it. They are not interested in what they can give God or what they can give his church. They are only concerned about me, myself, and I. And I think there's a range here, right? There's a range. You can end up anywhere in the middle too, but these are the two ends. And certainly we're seeking to be that A type of Christian and not that B type of Christian, right? Before we leave, let me say this. What are these 3 things right here? Number 1 is love the Lord your God with all your heart. Number 2 is love your neighbor as yourself. And number 3 is love yourself, isn't it? You think Jesus was trying to teach us this at the very beginning? He was, wasn't he? And all these things, it may seem different, but this actually should be all very familiar things. Let me blow up number 2 now. Let's talk about their influence as Christ's representative, that new thing that's added to our growth. We have to consider our influence on other people. And I think a Christian that considers their influence on other people as Jesus' representative is a mature Christian. That's the very sign of their maturity, is they're concerned about their influence. Paul was always concerned about his influence. Let's turn backwards to 1 Corinthians 9. 1 Corinthians 9, I'll explain the context after we do this reading. Chapter 9, starting in verse 19, you will see very quickly that Paul was very concerned about his influence as Christ's representative to others. Verse 19 says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. To the Jews I became a Jew that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those who are without law, as without law. Now, not being without law towards Christ or God, but being under law towards Christ, that I may win those who are without law," right? I tried to explain that as we read that. 22, "To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." And here's his motivation. "Now I do this for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." Paul says, I become all things to all men, that I might save some, right? And he's saying, I'm not doing this for my own personal gain. I'm doing it for the gain of the gospel. That's my motivation here. His desire to save others is so strong that he'll bend anything he can bend about himself to assimilate himself into a culture, right? To gain the trust of the people he's trying to teach. To Jews, he became like the Jewish Jew you've ever met. To Gentiles, he became the most Gentile person you've ever met. And that would have been a sacrifice to Paul. Now, what is he talking about in the context here? If we went backwards to verse 18, we would see what he's talking about in the context. He's talking about his refusal to accept support while working with the brethren at Corinth, from Corinth. That when he came into Corinth, he would not take money from them. Why would Paul not take money from the brethren at Corinth? Did he have the right to? You better believe he had the right to. And he tells them that several times in these epistles. But instead, he burdened the churches of Macedonia to support him so he could teach the gospel in Corinth. He had every right to take support from the people at Corinth. But why did he choose not to? He chose not to for the sake of being that A-type Christian. He considered his influence and the ability to gain trust with these people by taking money worth more than his personal gain in that moment. And you see how much he cares about this, right? And this is what's the truth. Some actions are purposed to solely gain the trust of others. There are things that you and me do, not because we have to, not because we want to, but solely to gain the trust of another person. Right? We do that all the time. We'll do it in business all the time without even thinking about it. If we think there's some way we can gain the trust of our employer or our boss or something like that, we will do anything we need to do that. Now, it becomes more tricky when it's our neighbor or our brother or our sister, where, I really want to do the thing I want to do. To use a practical example, let me use the old school example of cutting your grass on Sunday. I have never been in a situation, and maybe you haven't either, where there was a neighbor that you had that thought it was wrong to cut your grass on Sunday. But it's the perfect analogy to explain this chapter. This is a preacher's story, right? Who knows if it actually is true? But you've heard the analogy. The analogy goes like it is true that there were a time in the South and in the U.S. where many denominations taught that Sunday was a Christian Sabbath. And what they taught is that you were not allowed to work on Sunday because it was the Christian Sabbath, right? So the question is posed that you have a neighbor that holds that belief. You know that. You have a good relationship with that neighbor. And you know that he thinks it's sin and it's wrong to cut your grass on Sunday. He thinks it's wrong. And you are very influential with this neighbor. You hope to teach this neighbor the gospel. And you're posed in a situation like we are in Alabama, where your grass absolutely needs to be cut. You were busy all day Saturday. The only time you have to cut it is Sunday afternoon. And the weather says it's going to rain from Monday to Saturday for the next week. Your last chance to cut the grass is Sunday afternoon. What do? You know your neighbor's going to see you. It's your next door neighbor. They're going to hear you. What do? You have to make a decision whether your influence over that person is worth more than your personal gain at that moment. You have to make a decision. And that decision ends up telling you whether you're an A-type Christian or a B-type Christian. Do you actually care about your influence over others? Paul sacrificed his own liberties to gain more influence over others, and he considered that a worthy trade. He thought that was worth something to gain the trust and influence over others. That's why he's that A-type Christian. He considers it worthy. If you consider that worthy, a worthy sacrifice to not cut your grass, and I'll just let my grass go wild for the next week, you consider your influence of your brother or your neighbor to be more important than your personal gain at that moment. You're that A-type Christian. Now, if you say, no, you know what? Who cares? It's my neighbor. That's his own problem. I'm going to cut my grass because I need to. Well, you're closer to that B-type Christian, aren't you? And you don't consider that to be a worthy trade. And frankly, the people that do that in real life with real situations are the same people that aren't very evangelistic, are they? When a person decides, no, this isn't a worthy trade, I don't care what he thinks about me, I'm just going to do what I need to do right now. Are those people evangelistic? Do those people go out there and get contacts? Do those people come up to me and Jason and say, hey, will you come and study with this person? I'm trying to get... Those people don't do that at all. Because what are they concerned about? They're concerned about me, myself, and I. And those people aren't evangelistic. They don't have a priority for it, right? And that's a sad place to be. Continuing this thought, let's go on to chapter 10. Just flip one page over to chapter 10. Chapter 10, Paul commands the Corinthians to take on this same attitude with things like meat offered to idols. In 1 Corinthians 10, and I just need two bookmarks here, verse 23, Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each other's well-being, right? Paul making the point that, hey, you may have the right to do something, but it may not edify the people who see you do it. It may not be helpful to the people that you see you do it. And so you would be better off seeking the well-being of others than the well-being of yourself, right? That's the point he makes here. Now, he's talking about meat offered to idols. And if you haven't heard this before, basically it goes something like this, is that you had a lot of Gentile, ex-pagan Christians in the early church where they believed that those idols and those temples still represented and meant something. And when they would slaughter an animal in one of those pagan temples, often that meat would end up getting sold in the market of the city. And you wouldn't know unless they told you that, hey, this meat was offered in this temple. Well, if you were one of these ex-pagans, that would be offensive to you to eat that meat. You would think, oh no, I don't want to have anything to do with this, and you would consider that to be a way of abstaining yourself from the things you used to be a part of. And so what Paul tells the Corinthians here is, hey, the meat doesn't mean anything. The meat's just meat. You could eat it if you wanted to. But he says, if there's someone that bothers, you don't need to do that in front of them at all. You need to consider that other person's conscience and well-being over your own personal gain at that moment. So he's like, eat something different. Paul says, I'll just eat vegetables if that's what I need to do, right? Because that's his motivation of love, not of selfish ambition. He wraps up that thought with verse 33. He says, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. There's the priority again, right? I don't care about what I can get right now. I don't care about enjoying this meal right now. No, my number one concern is the salvation of others. My influence over others. My number one concern is me being Christ's representative for others, right? We have to consider our influence as Christ's representative more important than our own personal gain. That's a mature Christian. That's an A-type Christian, right? Last year during the election, and it happens every 4 years. I don't know why the world goes crazy during election year. I mean, like it happens every 4 years. But last year during the election, and elections before that, Christians have really struggled with their influence at those times. And this is the way that I try to remind myself and think myself about that. There are good, God-fearing Christians out there that during that election, they They could not understand another God-fearing Christian voting for Donald Trump. There were good God-fearing Christians out there that thought it was wrong to vote for Donald Trump or to endorse Donald Trump. And they're out there. There are also good God-fearing Christians that thought it was sinful and wrong to vote for Joe Biden. They're out there. There are good God-fearing Christians that think it is wrong to vote. It's sinful to vote in general. That's their personal opinion. They'll never do it. There are good God-fearing Christians out there that think it is wrong for a Christian to not vote. They think, no, Christians need to be voting, right? You should vote. I will never, ever share my opinion about that with you. I'll never tell you. The people I study with, I will never speak to them about it. Now, they try to bring it up to me and they want to know last year, hey, what do you think about this? I would say, well, I don't know anything about that. Actually, I have very strong opinions about politics. And the only people that get shared with that is Emily and maybe a few others. You will never, ever hear my public opinion about that. Or you'll never, ever hear that opinion about me publicly. Why? Because I'm so scared of closing doors on potential people to be Christ's representative, I'll never talk about it. I'm never going to say it. I'm never going to bring it up. I am not Joe Biden's representative. I'm not Donald Trump's representative. I am not voting's representative. I am not voting's representative. I am Jesus Christ's representative. And he's the only one I care about, especially when it comes about my influence on others. Right? Now, let me clarify something. I'm not telling you here not to have any opinions about things. I'm not telling you not to teach your children opinions about our republic and opinions about the way you think society should work. That's a good person to teach those things too, right? Romans 12 says, do not be wise in your own opinion, but I do believe you're allowed to be humble about your own opinion. But what I try to tell myself is consider those opinions to be privileges, where they're the only people that I'm going to share those personal opinions with is with people that I already have such a relationship with that they're never going to challenge my loyalty to Jesus. Where if they disagree with me, they would say, well, I understand where you're coming from, and I don't question at all whether you're in sin or whether you really love Jesus or not. Those are the type of people I'm only going to share that with. That means I'm going to share those things with my family, with my wife. You know, I've talked about history and politics a lot with Al Pridmore. I know that no matter what I say to Al Pridmore about my positions, he knows my loyalty to Jesus, and that's something we will share with each other, right? But with people on the internet, no way. I don't know who that is. That's a huge audience, right? With people up here at this pulpit, no way. Or in Bible class, never. Because I don't know what all y'all's opinions are. And I would never want anyone to question whether I'm truly Jesus' representative or not. So I just cast those things aside, don't I? Right? That's so much more important than any kind of personal agenda that I have. And one quick clarification, because Paul does it. This has never been an excuse to sin. Okay? You can't say, well, my representation of Jesus is so important that I need to go sin with this person because that's something that they would like for me to do. You know, people try to make the argument like, well, I'm going to go get drunk with this person because I want to convert this person, and they'll feel better if I'm drunk with them, right? Those people, can I use this word? And I know we don't use this word. Those people are stupid, okay? That's not a good argument, and it's not an argument, right? If you're a child, if your mom says you not to use that word, don't use it. And don't you dare use me as a reason why you can. But that's what that type of thought is, okay? It doesn't make any sense. And Paul clarifies with that. He says you can't go into the temple and make that argument. No, this is only talking about things that are doubtful things that God doesn't talk about, things that clearly are not sin. Let's bring up that thought about not seeking my own profit, but seeking the salvation of others. Because that's what he ends that thought with in 1 Corinthians 33. He says, I don't seek my own profit, I seek the salvation of others. And that's what I care about. That's my number one priority. I must find a line between my own agenda and God's agenda. And I'm not telling you this as someone who does this easily. It is difficult for me, and I constantly have to watch myself and go, okay, is this something that I believe, Or is this something that God believes, right? Is this something that I feel like is truth? Or is this something that God has revealed as truth? There's a fine line between those two things. These are God's agenda. This is God's beliefs. This is Andrew's agenda, and this is Andrew's beliefs. What I have to be careful of is not blending those two things together as if Andrew's agenda is also God's agenda. That's not true. You remember when Jesus, talking in Mark 7, he says, you're teaching your traditions as if they are the commandments of God. Those were people that were blending their agenda with God's agenda, and that just simply does not work, does it? This is what Paul says about that in 1 Corinthians 2. He says, for I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God, right? Paul says, when I came to you. Now, was this just in the pulpit? Was this just the public preaching he did? I think this was all the time when he was with people in Corinth. He says, when I was with you, right? I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's all I acted like I knew about, was Jesus Christ and things pertaining to his gospel. Now, did Paul have opinions about other things? Did Paul have beliefs about other things than Jesus and the gospel? Y'all, Paul was an educated man. Paul was someone who probably was taught from a very young age. These are things you should practice. These are things that are true. This is how society should work. This is how the government should work. Paul was probably taught all those things, and I believe Paul had opinions on those things. But what did he determine to know anything about when he was with the Corinthians? He only knew one thing. He knew Jesus Christ and him crucified. He knew the teachings of God. That's all he perceived to know. Because frankly, that's the only things that were important. Those are the only things that would consider and could help him with his influence for Christ and his being his representative. Let me put this in a real context. Several years ago, I was preaching a sermon, or maybe it was a Bible class, I don't remember. And I used an analogy about American history. I'm not going to tell you what the analogy was, lest it gets brought up again. But I used an analogy about American history that I was thought or assured of that everyone would have agreed with me about. And I thought, everyone knows this. And I used that as an example, as an analogy. And then I made my point, which was the biblical point that I needed to make, right? When that was all said and done, a brother came to me and he was very upset. And I was thinking like, oh no, what are you upset about? Did I say something wrong? He didn't care a thing about the God part. He was upset about the analogy that I used about American history. And he went on to tell me that I was very wrong about what I said. I shouldn't have said it about American history. And he knew better what really happened in that historical event, right? He was wrong. My history was right. I knew I was right. I went home and I got out my old textbooks to make sure I was right. And as I was writing him an essay about American history and thinking about how I was going to give it to him Wednesday night and say, hey, buddy, learn something, I had a moment of clarity. And that moment of clarity came from Paul's words here in 1 Corinthians. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. There's some clarity there. I threw away my essay. And in my moment of clarity and growth, I told him, hey man, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that took away from the message for you. And I'll look more into that. And that's the last conversation I ever had with him about the topic. And I was sure not to bring up the topic ever again. Because what did that do? That took away from Jesus Christ and him crucified. When you got Jesus Christ and him crucified at the forefront, nothing else matters. And I'll say, oh, I'm sorry. I'll throw away apologies because they cost me nothing. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I'm very sorry. I'll tell you, apologize to you all day if it means that I get to keep Jesus Christ and him crucified right here at the forefront. Now, when there is time to have a discussion and when there is time to have an argument, what does it need to be about? It needs to be about Jesus Christ and him crucified, right? And hopefully I've kept my influence up with that person, that would be important. Look at this last part here. That your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Why are we teaching Jesus Christ and him crucified? So that your faith and my faith will not be in worldly wisdom or my own agenda. No, it'll be in God's agenda and God's wisdom, right? Paul also said this, especially thinking of him being highly educated in the life that he used to live. Philippians 3:8, he says, yet indeed I count all things loss for the excellence of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I am suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, that I may gain Christ. What was all those other things around them that weren't have anything to do with God? He says they were rubbish, right? They were dung. They were nothing compared to the things that he had now. And when we have our priorities in check about those things, are we going to be eager to share things with others that might cost our influence over others? No. Our priorities will be in check. We'll have number one is our relationship with God. Number two, my influence over others for Christ. And number three, my well-being. I have no personal gain or personal agenda to win here. Not with my brothers or not with my neighbors. Let's wrap this up with one thought. We need to use our influences for God's glory, right? I think that should have been implied in a lot of the passages that we've read. It is not my job as a disciple to convert you to my beliefs, my personal agendas. It is not my job as a disciple to convert you to those things. Now, if you ask my opinion about something privately, I might decide to share it with you, but it's not my job to convince you or to convert you of those things. It is my job as a disciple to convince you and convert you of Jesus Christ and him crucified, right? The gospel, the word of God. That's the way I need to be using my influence. Romans 12, Paul says it very poetically. You remember this passage. It says, for though I say the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one of you a measure of faith. Just to stop right there, the thought is he's saying, guys, God has given me something, and now I'm sharing it with you. God has given you something, and he's expecting you to use that thing for his glory, for his church, for his kingdom, for his gospel. Verse 4, for we have many members of one body, but all of one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having these gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us use it in ministry. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. God's given us these abilities. He's given us the ability to lead. He's given us the ability to be merciful. He has given us the ability to be a minister, to administer something good, right? He's given us the ability to give, and we can give with liberality. Now, it should be implied. Why does God give us these abilities? Why did God give us these abilities? It should be very obvious. He gave us these abilities to use for his glory, right? Okay, did he give us these abilities for personal gain? Did he give us these abilities for selfish ambition? No, he gave us these abilities for his glory, for his church, for his gospel, for his kingdom, right? It is the saddest thing in the world to see Christians who have been given gifts by God, brethren everywhere, who have been given gifts by God. They have been given the gift of being influential. They have been given the gift of being sociable. They have been given the gift of being persuasive and convincing. And then they go out and they use that gift for everything but for God. That's disappointing, isn't it? Are we using our gifts for his glory or for our own personal agendas? That's something I have to ask myself. And I know I'm in a situation where I get to do this for a living, but I like to think that even if I did decide to teach, that I would still believe that I would be giving time and investing things into using my gifts for his glory, right? I like to think that I have been blessed with the ability to teach. And I'm very thankful for that, right? I think a lot of people have invested in that. I think Prattmont helped me develop that ability. I think Northwood did. I think for the past 8 years or something here at Gardendale, y'all have invested and taught me how to have that ability. And ultimately, I thank God that he's given me the ability to teach. And even if I did decide to make a living and teach something different, I would like to think that at the end of the day, I would still go, okay, but my number one agenda is to teach the gospel. Whether that is to make contacts with other people, whether it is to have private Bible studies, whether it is to teach Bible class or preach when I'm needed to. That would still be my number one priority, even though I had to make a living. That's what a disciple should do, right? That way, God won't look down and have given me that gift and say, Andrew, you're wasting that gift on carnal things. But I gave you that gift for me. That would be a terrifying thing, right? And hey, not so much here, but I have always been shocked when I meet brethren, especially in other places, and I get to eat dinner with brethren, and get to know brethren, and they obviously have the gift of being sociable and influential and persuasive. And the whole time I'm with them, they don't try to talk to me about God. They try to peddle me something. To see Christians get caught up into things that have nothing to do with Jesus Christ and him crucified, and they spend all their energy and their talents and their gifts peddling something for personal gain. Many of y'all remember in the 90s, not so much now, but there was like a homeschool movement amongst the brethren. And it is fine to try to pull your children out and homeschool them. If you have the funds and the knowledge and the education that you can teach your children at home, go for it. That's great. I have no problem with that. I think that's a good thing to do, and I think it's especially a good thing to do in certain situations. However, there were brethren in the 90s that were up doing exhortations, telling people they need to homeschool their kids. And every time you spoke to them, they didn't want to talk to you about Jesus. They were going to talk to you about the importance of homeschooling. And they were trying to sell you that textbook material and all that kind of stuff too. And that's all that they were about. And you wonder, God gave you this gift to be influential and you're wasting it on teaching people to be homeschooled? What a disappointment. How many times have Christians peddled to you their political agenda? How many times have Christians peddled to you their conspiracy theory? How many times do Christians peddle to you their pyramid scheme? Their medical internet degree? What all is that? In my mind, that's God bestowing his children gifts and those poor children wasting their gifts on personal agendas. How disappointing. How disappointing. What are we, though? Are we that A type of Christian or that B type of Christian? Because an A type of Christian counts all those things as rubbish that they might gain Christ. That A type of Christian, the majority of what they talk to you about is Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's that Christian who Paul was. And as I look around this room, that's what type of Christian a lot of people are in this room right here. And I appreciate and I thank you for that. Thank you for your close attention. If there's anyone here that has yet to obey the gospel, hopefully this group here has been persuasive and have influenced you enough that that's the most important thing that you need to do. And hopefully when you're around brethren, that's what's on your mind because that's the type of thing that they talk about. If there's anyone here that like to obey the gospel call of Jesus Christ, if we can assist you with that, please come forward as we stand and sing.